from the off. Somebody said it for me, but just to note again to people that the session is recorded. So today's session will be an overview of 2 research projects that were funded by the Housing Agency Research Programme. And just a quick note on that, the Housing Agency has a live call for proposals at the moment. This closes on the 30th of August. And if anybody wants more detail on that, just go to the Housing Agency website. So our first presentation will be from Helen Russell. Helen is a research professor and head of the Social Research Division at the ESRI. Her research covers a range of interconnecting issues relating to equality and social inclusion. She has a long-standing interest in housing as a key dimension of social inclusion, and recently developed a framework to monitor the right to adequate housing in Ireland in conjunction with the IHREC. Helen will present a report written by herself, James Lawrence, and Emer Smith. This piece of research explores the influence of housing and, importantly, neighbourhood quality on parent and child well-being. Taking a multi-dimensional approach to measuring inadequate housing by looking at the size of the home, the garden or play space, heating efficiency, presence of damp, along with other key aspects including the number of times families have had to move and the type and nature of their tenure. Our second presentation will be from Sarah Lannon. Sarah is the Research and Policy Officer with the Peter McVerry Trust. In her current role, Sarah has begun an innovative employment-based programme, developing research in the NGO sector and also working towards her own PhD with the School of Education in University College Dublin. By using participatory action research methods, the focus of Sarah's PhD is on supporting access and engagement to education for youth in underserved communities with a specific focus on youth homelessness prevention. And Sarah's educational background also touches on education as well. Sarah will present a report, again funded by the Housing Agency Research Support Programme, and our study aimed to investigate the experiences of care leavers living in CAS-funded properties, the support available to them, as well as the challenges in providing long-term support and tenancy sustainment. So I'll hand over now, first of all, to Helen, who will run through her presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Patrick. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So I'd just like, first of all, to say thank you to the Housing Agency for funding this research. I'll be presenting it on behalf of my 2 co-authors, James Lawrence and Emer Smith. So, okay, good, it's moving. So as Patrick said, we're taking a kind of broad view of adequate housing, and our question that we're looking at here is how does living in inadequate housing shape the well-being of families? So we're taking a broad view of adequate housing, building on earlier work, which looks not only at the physical condition of the housing, the facilities within the home, but also dimensions of the suitability of housing for family and the quality of the local environment. There's been quite a lot of research, I suppose, looking at adults and the effects of poor housing, different aspects of like overcrowding, and also of the neighborhood and what impact this has on adult well-being. There's quite strong evidence there, also strong evidence on health outcome, physical health outcomes. There's probably less evidence for children, although there is a good deal around the quality of the neighborhood environment and children's well-being. And there's less, I suppose, looking at the mechanisms or the pathways through which inadequate housing affects children's well-being, and that's what we're focusing on here, trying to dig into what that pathway actually is. So we draw on the family stress model, which was developed really around poverty, and to explain how the mechanisms behind poor child outcomes in disadvantaged families. And the explanation really, or the model, centers around, that economic hardship and poverty lead to acute and chronic stressors for individuals, such as, the constant worry around paying bills and other issues. And that these stressors have negative outcomes for a whole range of family well-being, like partnership quality, depression, and that these in turn affect parenting styles and the relationship with children, and then can have negative child outcomes. So we're particularly, as I say, focusing in on how inadequate housing leads to negative parental outcomes, and how this impacts child development. So the key questions in the report, and I won't go through all of them in this quick presentation, but which families are at risk of poor housing, how does it shape children's outcomes, and how does it shape parental outcomes too. So as I mentioned, we're using this multi-dimensional indicator of inadequate housing. So it covers housing conditions. You can see them here. It's things like suitability of the housing, whether there's damp or leaks, whether it's too small or not child-friendly, being unable to keep the house warm, availability of outdoor space. Then there's questions around the neighborhood conditions, so perceived neighborhood disorder, and then low social capital in the area. So this is around the relationships within the community, trust in neighbors, and willingness to help, the sort of availability of support. So I won't go through these now, but if you have questions on them later, I can talk more about them. We also have a range of measures on parental and child outcomes. So the parental outcomes, we look at a range here. So they're sort of mental, social and relational, and physical. So you'll see here the list, so things like finding parenting stressful, relationship with a child. These are all scales, closeness and conflict with child. And there's also physical health, which we're not particularly looking at here in this presentation. And then for the child outcomes, we're focusing in on the strengths and difficulties. So this is social and emotional development. It's a really widely used measure. It picks up on things like child's anxiety, peer problems, hyperactivity, all of those sort of issues. And it's a scale. And I can come back to that. We're drawing on the Growing Up in Ireland data from 3 years to 9 years old. We're focusing on mothers, and we're looking at outcomes at 9 years of age, but we're looking at the effect of exposure to poor housing conditions all across those earlier waves as well. So this is the great advantage of the Growing Up in Ireland, that we can follow over time. So it's the length of exposure to these poor conditions. And we can go on to kind of get a bit at causality, because we look at this over time influences. And just to highlight a couple of limitations, even though the Growing Up in Ireland is really an excellent data source, and you've seen the range of measures we have there, there are limitations. So small numbers of travellers or families in direct provision, so we can't identify them separately. And I suppose with all of these sort of surveys, that you would expect that the individuals that are most disadvantaged, most excluded, particularly like the homeless, are not going to be captured in the survey. And they, those who maybe have the most unstable housing trajectories are likely to drop out, because you're talking about going back to families year after year. So, I mean, there's a lot of effort to try and track them, but obviously if families are moving very often, that we may not, we're quite likely to lose them from the study. So going to the results of, first of all, which families are most at risk of prolonged exposure to inadequate housing. And you can see here, this basically summarizes a lot of findings. So the measures are on the top here of the dimensions of poor housing, and then the risk groups here. So you can see, as you might expect, low income is one of the really strong predictors. But even net of that, some groups we see as being, you know, structurally disadvantaged. They're disadvantaged across nearly all of the outcomes. So lone parent households and parents, households where the parent has a disability, and also households where the child has a disability. And this may be connected to the, you know, additional needs and costs, housing costs that those families might have. We also find the results here around nationality and the tenure of the home. So compared to the owner occupied, we see social housing, those living in social housing more likely to have these prolonged experiences of inadequate housing, and also in the private rented sector, but to a lesser extent there. So how do the experience of inadequate housing, link to child and parental well-being? So first of all, just looking at the children themselves. So this is looking at children at age 9. It's controlling for earlier child well-being. So it's quite a strong model that we use. This is, we control for lots of other things in the models. But you can see here that a whole range of these inadequate housing conditions have an effect of increasing difficulties for young children. So higher difficulty, social emotional difficulties. So these are sort of the overcrowding, the too small, the damp conditions, struggling to heat the home. And also these two neighborhood characteristics come out as significant, the neighborhood disorder and the low social capital, low cohesion in the area. So as I say, we are particularly interested in this study is, you know, can we find, you know, what's the pathway through which children are being, are affected? Is it coming through the parental issues that we've that the family stress model highlights? So if we look here first at the measure of whether the home is too small, we can see that this impacts on, so the middle row here is all of the measures for all of the outcomes for the mother. So we find that mothers living in homes that are too small are more likely to find parenting stressful, and this in turn has a negative effect on children's socio-emotional well-being. Similarly, here for the poor conditions, we find that mothers in house spending a longer time in houses with these conditions have higher levels of depression, and again, this has a follow through to the child's well-being score. We can see here for the going on to the next measure of inadequate housing, the struggle to heat the home. You can see that this has again a whole range of negative impacts on mothers, higher depression, more finding parenting more stressful, influencing their parenting style, how they interact with their children, and also the perceptions of closeness with the child that reduces, and the conflict with child increases. So there's a whole range of negative outcomes here, and each of these have then a follow-through effect for the child well-being. Finally, then looking at the two neighborhood measures. So again, there's a lot of red lines here. So you can see that living in an area that's characterized by more disorder, again, very strong effects on mother's depression, finding parenting stressful, and again, the relationship with the child, parenting style, closeness and conflict. And these then again follow through and have an impact on the child's well-being score. So to conclude, wrap it up, we can see from the study that there's some families are much more at risk of inadequate housing, especially low income and lone parent households and households where someone has a disability. This is associated with poor outcomes for both the children and the parents. And that we do see that there is this pathway through that's proposed by the family stress model, that living in poor housing has a stressor effect, and that has an impact on relationships with children, mother's depression, and this has a strong effect on child outcomes. So just to pull out a few of the policy implications that we highlight in the study, I suppose there's understandably a strong policy focus on housing supply and on affordability, but we also need to have a focus on quality of housing. The other thing that really I think jumps out from the study is the importance of communities when we're considering housing. The social fabric of the neighborhood is really important. So investing in that physical and social infrastructure of neighborhoods can have dividends in terms of child health and development. And we say especially in social areas with social housing, just because those particular areas were scoring high in terms of disorder and lower in social cohesion. So I suppose some of the more targeted issues then we discuss are around, this finding that being unable to heat the home has particularly negative impacts on well-being and physical health. So I think those measures around fuel poverty and supporting low-income families to meet energy costs, but also we mentioned in the report some of those retrofitting and those sort of policies, which I suppose there's a need for those in the social housing and private rental sector in particular. And again, this finding around the disadvantaged experience by lone parents and households where someone has a disability, I suppose again underlines the importance of addressing poverty, child poverty, and housing for these particular groups. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks a million for that, Helen. And something I forgot to say to everyone at the start, just if you have questions, pop them into Q&A. I know some of you have done so already, and we're going to then run through Sarah's presentation. We'll do all the questions then at the end. So I'll hand over to Sarah for her presentation, if that's okay. You ready to go, Sarah?
Yeah, perfect. I'll just share my screen. So is this visible?
Yeah, you're good to go, Sarah.
Okay, hi everybody, Sarah Lannon here, research officer at Peter McVerry Trust, and then also going towards my PhD as well. So just to start with, this is our project, so Life After Care, Perspectives on Path for Care Leavers Model of Support, provided by Peter McVerry Trust, and I'm speaking on behalf of the authors, myself, Ivana Keenan, Elizabeth Penny, and Tanya Blight. So just to provide you a bit of background to the report. So in the past decade, youth homelessness has seen an increase across the globe. So this is prompting increased global awareness and a necessity for action. So particularly in Ireland, so from 2016 to 2023, we saw a 138% increase of youth directly accessing emergency accommodation. And so as young individuals find themselves without stable accommodation, they encounter really significant challenges and increasing marginalization from society. So this includes barriers to accessing education, employment, healthcare supports. But in particular, young people with histories of state care or transitioning out of state care are identified as highly, highly vulnerable to falling into homelessness. So we're navigating the transition from state care to independent housing often represents like a really, really precarious journey. So in recognition of this, the Irish government has built on an existing funding structure for social housing known as the Capital Assistance Scheme, to specifically support the housing needs for individuals with experiences of safe care. So through this funding scheme, Peter McVerry Trust, a national housing and homeless charity, has acquired properties and where required then has made them fit for purpose, and then they continue to provide ongoing support to care leavers within these properties. So with all of this in mind, the present study aimed to investigate the experiences of youth living in these CAS-funded properties. So to understand the lived experiences of these youth at different stages of their life journeys, to examine the supports available to them. So to examine what ways the staff provide support at different levels of the organisation, and to identify any challenges to providing this care and the support, and also to supporting tenancy sustainment. So, and then to identify any additional supports or targeted areas for enhancement. And then finally, just to support the expressed needs of youth be heard and recognised. So I hope we're doing them justice with this research piece. And then again, just want to really thank the Housing Agency for supporting this through the research support programme, and all the youth who spent time with me, and all the staff as well. So just to give you an overview of the Peter McVerry Trust and the Capital Assistance Scheme. So since it started in 2017, Peter McVerry Trust have acquired 48 properties, and they currently have 50 youth in the properties. So there's 2 sets of youth cohabiting. The majority of the young people are aged between 21 to 28. We have 60% males, 38% female, and 2% other. And there's a wide range of people living in their properties from less than 1 year to over 5 years. And then you can see here in the little graph, the local authorities. And so there's a range of locations where these properties are based. And then these are the supports available within the organisation to people living in the CAS-funded properties. So before they even move in, there's a lot being done around the property acquisition and the development of the properties. Then there's a lot being done with TUSLA in participant placement. So Peter McVerry Trust would sit on aftercare steering committees, and then would support the appropriate placement of the young people in the appropriate properties at the given time of their life journeys. Once they're in their properties, they're provided targeted support through Peter McVerry Trust Housing with Supports programme. So every young person is assigned a CAS housing officer. And we'll go into what that role entails a bit further on. But then there's also, through referrals within the organisation, additional educational and employment support, addiction support, and any young person who has pre-existing relationships with Peter McVerry Trust Children's Residential and Aftercare Services still receive ongoing support from the key workers, from the residential services that they were in, from the services and from the staff themselves. And this could look like sending Christmas cards, or actually having them at their services at Christmas time, or sending birthday cards. So what do we actually do? So we did 11 semi-structured interviews with youth, and we ran 3 focus groups with Peter McVerry staff. So we had CAS housing officers, aftercare support workers, management and directors involved. And just taking into account the pre-existing vulnerabilities of these young people, we really strongly emphasised the ethics involved with this research piece. So we went through a rigorous TUSLA research ethics application, and it was approved. We had ongoing engagement with the staff involved with the young people, had participant screening, and had cooling off periods for engagement with the research piece. And then we also provided options for the young people of where they would like their interviews to be done. So they had the options of our offices, or then we also had the option of if they'd like us to come to their homes. And every single one of them asked us to go to their homes, which was really lovely, was really relaxing. And it just gave them a sense of comfort in being able to talk about their experiences within their own environment. And then finally, before we submitted our final report to the Housing Agency, then we also provided the young people with the full report, and also a wrote up a plain English summary. And met with a few of the youth as well to provide them the information about the report, and just to get any feedback on their thoughts of the final report itself, just to support and making sure that it was an accurate reflection of their lived experiences. So who was actually interviewed for this piece? We had 7 young males and 4 females, the age between the ages of 19 to 25. They lived in their properties for around 2.5 years, but ranging from 6 months to 5 years. And the interviews then lasted between 20 to 45 minutes. And it's just very important to just to keep in mind that A lot of these youth spoke of experiences of addiction, of international protection, of early teenage pregnancies and motherhoods as also influencing their housing journeys to get to these properties. So what were the findings from this report? So firstly, we're just going to look at how they received the backgrounds to receiving access to the properties, their experiences with Peter McVerry Trust, and their descriptions and their satisfaction with the overall properties and the locations of them as well. So every single youth that was that was interviewed spoke of a history of unstable living, whether that was within the Kerry system and multiple residential foster care placements, or afterwards as well. So specifically young men spoke of episodic periods of homelessness when trying to engage with private rental markets. So one young person, these are all pseudonyms, by the way. So one young person said, John, for example, said, I became homeless when I was 20 during COVID. Your man sold the building. So I was homeless again. Like that's the second time I was homeless just over landlords. But what they did say was they all spoke super, super, super highly of their TUSLA aftercare workers in supporting them access these properties. What should be mentioned is that there was a bit of confusion from the youth's perspectives as to why they received the properties over other of their friends also applying for these programs. And they themselves put it down to that they're quite high quality TUSLA aftercare workers. And then moving on to their first experiences with Peter McVerry Trust and the properties. So any period of change, of transition for anybody are heightened periods of vulnerability, but this is more so for people who have these experiences, pre-existing vulnerabilities. So they were both positive and negative overwhelming experiences. And what kind of led to this was they were overwhelmed about having a stable roof over their heads, but they were also overwhelmed in the fact that they didn't get to see the properties when before they moved in. So for example, one young person said, that's the one thing I did not like because I didn't get to see it first. I didn't get to know exactly where or how far I needed to travel. And if I needed a car because I don't drive at the moment. And this is just looking at the wider concept of limited housing available and an ongoing housing crisis and not necessarily having the choice or the decision or being involved in those decision-making processes. And then because of those overwhelming experiences, so the first time seeing the property, having this place for themselves, there was limitations and barriers in being able to engage with the tenancy agreement. So for example, and nearly every youth said something along these lines of, my aftercare worker went through it, I signed it, to be honest, I don't really look at them things. And what happened as a result of this for a lot of the youth was, as they settled into their properties, they started thinking about the practicalities of, say, okay, well, I'm in this property now, but I want my partner to move in. What happens then? Or, oh, I want to go away for a year. Do I still have this property? So there was just questions and queries that started coming up around their tenancy agreement once they'd settled into their properties. But when we were talking about the quality of the properties themselves, so they were all really, really, really valued the high quality and the fully furnished properties. And it'll come up a bit with the staff findings. But Peter McVerry Trust actually fully furnished all the properties prior to the youth moving in, so to give them a home. Most were satisfied with the location. Nearly all of them were satisfied. Just some youth spoke of pre-existing relationships with the communities that were negative and that they didn't like the people in the communities, knew their families, and that kind of they felt held them back in their abilities to grow. But what they did really value was the tailored rent. So if somebody was in full-time employment and their hours were reduced or they were made unemployed, Peter McVerry Trust would very, very, very quickly tailor the rental rates to the income. And so it just gave them that support around the financial security piece. And this is a lovely quote from one of the young people about the property and having this place. And Jane said, I never had a proper family home. That's mine. And now I can look after it and do what I like. And that was a piece that kept coming up a lot. It was the sense of ownership over the property and wanting to look after it and wanting to take care of it, and it was building that security net around it. And then just then looking at and delving further into what their thoughts were on how Peter McVerry Trust provided them support. So there was a whole range of supports, and this was predominant. They spoke of predominantly around their CAS housing officers, because this would have been the main point of contact, but they still would have been involved with the management. They would have had aftercare support workers that they could reach out to. So they would have, the CAS housing officers then and the team would have provided practical tenancy support, and this would have been around setting up bills, direct debits, supporting financial elements of the housing, and also with the maintenance as well. And the maintenance piece was an area that the youth themselves flagged, that there's a wide range of satisfaction levels with how the maintenance was, the speed of the maintenance. So some youth said that that was great and that whatever they needed they got the next day, whereas other youth said that they had to keep repeatedly asking. So there was just that element there. But one of the key elements of the support that was provided to the youth was the social support, and every single one of them had valued the really meaningful relationships that they built with their CAS housing officers. So Sam, a young person, says, for example, I feel like if I needed anything, I could ring CAS housing officer and they would straight away sort it out for me. So they really valued having someone that they could lean on, someone that they could reach out to whenever they needed. So that could be a text every now and then, or that could be 2 or 3 visits a week. And what this did was this provided youth with a sense of stability and a sense of security to be able to start planning for their futures and preparing. And Max, for example, says, I could never plan to the future because I didn't know where I was going to be, what was going to happen. So I had the security. It was like a foundation to build from. Yeah, without it, I don't know where I'd be. I don't know what I'd be doing. This is just kind of the elements of the CAS housing scheme structure in conjunction with the social support that's provided by the team on the ground. And then just looking at their perceptions of the support. So they all mentioned different approaches to the type of support that the CAS housing officer would provide. So it was all tailored to the individual. So if they said, do you know what, I'm okay for the moment. I'm very busy with work. I'm very busy with other elements. Could you please just send me a text every now and then? I know, respond, and then we can check in every now and then. Or if they needed more support, and that was provided to them as well. But there was a very good balance of respecting the young person's voice, but also providing them with the support they needed when they needed it. And then this was also supported by a wraparound network of staff. So youth with pre-existing relationships with Peter McVerry Trust had more people that they could engage with, that they could contact, that they could lean on for support. So one young person says, with certain people in the trust, like you get to know people, like you can still ring them and tell them if something happened. They do everything in their power to help you. Like even if they couldn't, they do try and they do something. And then just coming up to the findings from the staff. So looking at how the staff provided the support and what their thoughts were on the support that was being provided. So they really, really strongly emphasised a trauma-informed approach and an innovative turn the key concept, where they emphasised and they highlighted that the points of transitioning into these properties are, again, really heightened periods of vulnerability for the youth. And they wanted to create homes that the young people could just start living in and not just houses. So they provided all the elements of a home. And these would be, so for example, one of the management says the beds would be made and the delf in the cupboards, the cutlery is in the drawers. There's toilet roll in the bathroom, there's towels, so we can kind of just try to make it as easy as possible for them. And then moving on to the nature of the support that's provided. So again, there's a huge emphasis on the initial placement support with managing, supporting periods of isolation, of loneliness, of supporting young people's practical skills. And it's access to this multidisciplinary team and the knowledge and resources available across the organisation. So people engaging with the addiction support services. There's there's nurses, there's the day services, there's the residential services, and then there's also the education and employment elements as well. And then the frontline responsibilities. So with regards to the frontline responsibilities, the CAS housing officer holds many, many hats. And so they're looking at managing a dual landlord where they're collecting rents, and they're managing the property they're managing the maintenance of the property, while also then being that a social care provider and supporting that young person engage with society. And there is mixed responses as to whether or not this was a beneficial piece, but the management highlighted the abilities to support tenancy sustainment by managing the properties as both a landlord and a social support provider. So they do have to follow the RTB regulations, but there's an extra level of care and support provided around all these pieces. And it was just creating this network of people to build on this security network for the young people. So someone says, young people going through the care system have a lot of change in their life and a lot of professionals in and out of their lives. And what we've kind of reflected on in the work that we carry out is, that even if they have one or two consistent people in their lives, that's going to be the support that they need. So it's just, there's a strong emphasis here on the relationships built and sustaining those relationships. And then just finally coming to the key challenges. So with regards to the frontline staff holding many responsibilities and many hats, there is the element of the limited staffing levels. And if there was more staff that were able to hold different responsibilities, then this as a key challenge to providing support wouldn't be as strong. And it also, and while the frontline staff mentioned all of this, it actually didn't come across in the youth interviews that this was something that the youth felt. And then there's a lot around the geographical traveling times and engaging with youth across a wide spread of areas. So if there's more team hubs or more units, there'd be more time staff believed to be able to engage with the youth and provide more meaningful care and support. So the staff mentioned it's hard being on the ground, dealing with everything going on, getting phone calls, emails, it's borderline impossible. But again, from the youth perspective, this wasn't there, and it's really lovely to see how much the staff or the young people really valued the relationship they built with the staff. So just a summary of the findings. So through fostering security and stability for young individuals with experiences of state care, this project demonstrates the importance of the CAS for Care Leavers model and the model of care provided by Petermore Ferry Trust in both preventing and intervening in youth homelessness. So there's high tenancy sustainment rates across the board, and people have moved from homeless services into these CAS housings as well, and then provided the support that they needed within the CAS properties. So the provision of stable housing in conjunction with the wraparound support services served as a foundation for youth progression towards independence. Nonetheless, addressing the obstacles identified by participants in the study would empower youth to continue with their further integration into society, develop new skills, and explore additional avenues for personal growth along their journeys. So just finally, these are the recommendations from the report. So we have some for the wider CAS system, and then we have some specifically targeted at Petermore Ferry Trust service provision. So CAS funding supports the property development and the acquisition, and there are different social supports available for the funding of the properties, whereas if it's one cohesive unit, young people can move into these properties and there isn't that barrier to start living as an independent person. So supporting and funding a new initiative turnkey concept. And then looking at potentially a wider CAS housing regulation guidebook with the hopes of the expansion of this program with more properties and more organizations involved in it, and just having a standard procedural approach to addressing, okay, well, what happens if a partner wants to move in? What happens if the young person wants to move away for a year? And again, just clarity on access opportunities for the CAS housing. So there's so much work being done, and it's absolutely brilliant to see that people are being placed in these properties at the right times of their life journeys. But just for the young people and for the staff on the front lines to know what are the prerequisites for accessing this CAS housing and how young people can get into these properties. And then that's just building on reviewing care leavers' housing needs. So if a young person falls into homelessness with a pre-existing, who come from state care, and being able to take them out of it as quickly as possible and to provide them with a CAS property. So maybe an annual review of the young person's needs up until the age of when they're staging out of the aftercare services. And then a lot of youth expressed desires for home ownership. So looking at ways in which they can be supported out of CAS properties into home ownership in the future. And then this is kind of more at the Peter McVerry Trust, but if there's any AHBs that be interested in being involved, it's looking at expanding on the multidisciplinary team. So having a CAS housing officer and having say, for example, a peer support specialist who supports the transition into the properties, helps them integrate into society, helps manage the loneliness and the isolation piece, and then also then having a maintenance and rents officer who oversees the practical elements of the role. So to provide a network of staff within a network of staff. And then just to support young persons' engagement with the tenancy agreement, a plain English tenancy agreement, and an online maintenance portal to support the young person be aware of their responsibilities, but also the organization's responsibilities, and to know at what stage their maintenance requests have gone. And then finally, just there was 4 youth who had been unemployed who had registered to start in education, but none of the youth started for a variety of reasons, for structural reasons that courses didn't start, for personal reasons that, for example, mental health. But there is that drive and there is that motivation from the youth to re-engage with education and employment. And so additional targeted support focus on education and employment. So thank you very much. That is me. This is our report. It is on our website and my contact details are there if anybody wants to ask any further questions or queries or chat about it. Would greatly appreciate it from my end as well.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That was really interesting, and the report is well worth a look for anybody who hasn't read it. So we might jump straight into the Q&A if Helen and Sarah are okay with that. Okay, so right, so the first question is for Helen, and it's about neighbourhood disorder and how is that defined? So kind of part of that question is, do disordered neighbourhood correlate with Unpubble deprivation index score, or is it more connected to the Garda Pulse system data?
Yes, so it's the neighbourhood disorder comes from questions again to the primary caregivers. So it's around there's 4 items and they're asked about how common certain issues are in their neighbourhood. So it's things like rubbish and litter lying around, homes and gardens in bad condition, vandalism and deliberate damage to property, and people being drunk or taking drugs in public. So it's a combination of those 4. It would be very nice to also be able to link in at the, those, something like the Pubble deprivation, at the area level, some of those sort of more objective indicators, I suppose. It would be possible to link the geocode in to the growing up in Ireland data, but we haven't been CSO haven't permitted that yet. But I think that would be a really, really useful resource, because then I think the neighborhood and the area dimension is so important for a whole range of questions, and I think being able to add that information in would be important. So I think they're both useful. The sort of the more objective. I mean, I don't know about Pulse data, whether that's available in any data set, any one that's available to researchers. But again, you could look at how those things are correlated. But you would expect it to be picking up, I suppose, maybe dimensions of both. But it's really how the neighborhood is experienced by the person themselves.
Great, thanks, Helen. I'm just going to kind of go back and forth maybe between the two of you, just not to focus on one all in one go. So just the next question for Sarah, or Sarah, sorry, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
This is from someone that's working in the north, and they've just mentioned that there's been some interesting developments in the UK around care experience as a protected characteristic, which has then led to some measures such as council tax exemption and priority for social housing. So I suppose just one, maybe just in case it's not fully understood, just to say that the CAS funding stream is a grant fund. But Sarah, I'll just hand over to you on that one.
Anyone who has experiences, I'm not sure the question. So anyone who has experiences of state care and who's been in it for, I believe, it's 6 months or more, is entitled to apply and get access to the CAS housing. However, it's looking at the wider housing crisis. It's looking at where properties are available, how properties are available. It's a wider piece of engagement with the TUSLA aftercare support workers, identifying if this person really needs this property at this moment in time. So some young people transitioning out of care will go into student accommodation, and they won't necessarily need that CAS housing at that time, but they may need it after that. So it's just looking at the right time for the right person in the right place. I hope that answers the question.
I think so, Sarah, yeah. So Helen, just another question for yourself there. Just you've mentioned mothers a lot in the parental stressor indicator. There is a lot of research on the correlation between mothers' mental health and child outcomes. Did the research focus on mothers rather than parents?
Yes, yeah, good point. Yeah, so the Growing Up in Ireland study does collect information from both the mothers and fathers. We did initially look at fathers as well. We just for brevity, I think, just focused on mothers, but also partly because when we looked at it, so there is that link between housing and fathers' outcomes, but both that relationship and then the relationship for the child outcomes was weaker. So we focus on the mothers. I suppose the other issue with the fathers is that you don't have the the response is a bit lower. I think there's a particular issue around non-resident fathers. And this is something that came up with in the discussions with our steering group, so for fathers who are not in the in the residence with the child, their access to adequate housing is really important as well, and that can have really negative impacts, on their relationship with the child if they're not able to have access to a place where the child can visit and stay. So I think that's an area that really needs more research. There is some follow up of the non-resident fathers, but we haven't got access to that. But I think that's really an important issue that's kind of missing from that picture, and of course that will have impacts for children's well-being as well if they can't sustain that relationship with the father because of the housing problems as well.
Okay, thanks, Helen. Just we'll go back to Sarah now, and just are the young people provided a permanent housing with secure tenancies as part of that? I suppose follow on to that, be keen to hear more about the tailored rents. So I suspect this is maybe from someone who may not have a full. Is it a differential rent, Sarah, or is it an economic rent maybe?
So it's tailored to the young person's income. So okay. Whether or not that income changes, the young person's rents then would be changed very quickly in response to that. And then it's a long-term tenancy sustainment, there's the idea that the young person can stay in this property for as long as they would wish to. If there is an expression that they would like to move on to other social housing, or if they want to move into different housing pathways, then they are supported to do that also.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Sarah. Just it's more a question for myself, Sarah. It's kind of links to maybe two things. So obviously you've called out in the reported difficulties that that kind of CAS housing officer has, and the tension between the twin roles and things like that. Like, would you see any merit in separating out the housing aspect of this and maybe having that delivered elsewhere, and maybe other organizations providing that support to kind of neatly separate it out, or have you thought about that? Or
it's a really interesting piece, and I think what we do see is there with the young person as well, there is an existing interagency piece, but I think a huge element of it is the relationship that is built with the young person and their abilities to then be able to express their needs and express their wishes, and having maybe one cohesive unit that these are all working for the same organization might be able to provide kind of more knowledge sharing within what can be done for the young person. Just one of the many options, one of many thoughts.
Yeah, so more so maybe a model where the support and housing are provided by the same organization, but there's just a little neat separation of the two functions, perhaps. Is that
yeah, and I suppose I can't say on behalf of any of the other organizations, but I think it would work within the Peter McVerry Trust to separate those two roles. So to have that CAS housing officer to provide the social support, and then someone else to look after the maintenance and the rents element of it, but to have good communication between the team unit that's able to do that.
Great. And just one other question for myself. I again, throughout the report, it was very much, would you have a view on, the TUSLA aftercare worker and the quality of worker that was assigned to you, and that being very much an important factor in getting access to this housing? Like, I suppose that for me at least, that would make me a little bit anxious, I must say. Like, was that perception, or
and that is a very important piece to highlight. That was from the youth's experiences of it. So when a young person is provided a property, the TUSLA aftercare worker is heavily involved with that, so they would see all the work that's being done by that person. And so it's not saying that it's that element of the high quality piece, but it's saying that they perceived that that they were provided with really high quality support by their TUSLA aftercare workers, and that was one of the contributing factors to them receiving the properties.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose I was thinking from a an allocation of that support point of view. Like, is there any kind of, I suppose, protections you put in place to ensure that it doesn't, I suppose, that isn't as much of an actual factor then, that it depends on how good an advocate you have, as opposed to some kind of way of prioritizing people in a kind of a depersonalized way or something?
Absolutely. And I suppose, having worked on this report for a year, I see the amount of work that's done into supporting the young people into these properties, and the decision making that's involved in, is this the right time for this young person? What other support services can be provided instead of this, because it might not be the right time for this young person, but we'll support them to develop their skills so that they can move into independent living. So and the young people may not necessarily see that piece, but I just thought it was important to highlight the youth's perspectives on that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, in fairness, the report does go into a nice bit of detail on how they are allocated, and it's hard to see that it would be just I've a client here type of type of thing.
But even just for the young people, because they all speak amongst themselves, and there is that confusion piece, and if possible to provide that clarity for the young people.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me on to another question, if you don't mind, Sarah. Like, you mentioned there about the CAS Housing Regulations Guidebook. Was that about, like, I suppose I'm thinking of, it's very dated, but say VHU 02 or the Green Book, as most AHBs would note. Is it something along those lines, an update of that, or is it something slightly different?
I suppose like this funding stream has only really been around since 2017. So with that, it's building on the tailored supports for the individuals within the properties. And these young people are going to be, or might be in their properties for a long time, and it's looking at supporting them, but also making sure that nothing happens that jeopardizes their tenancies.
Okay.
And providing that clarity around that. So, for example, if they want to bring in partners, if they have children, is this
Okay.
the suitable property when it was provided to them as a one-bed unit, or do they need to move to a different housing structure? But it's just young people are starting to think about those things the longer they're in the properties. So it's just clarity and maybe a wider guidebook on the steps
Almost
and what
like
happens in those situations.
almost like a tenant handbook.
Yeah, and I suppose it's bringing it back to the AHPs as well, because they would, or what Peter referred to us, would address these on a case-by-case basis. And
Yes.
so with the hope of the expansion of a program like this, you'd want it standardized across the board.
Great. Okay, I understand you. Okay. That's it from the Q&A. So just double check just in case I've missed anything. And I suppose with just one, like, maybe comment more so than question on Helen's one, like you mentioned at the outset, some kind of data limitations and things like that. But I think you kind of touched on it. But like, obviously, the housing discourse, for as long as I've been working in it, at least, has been totally dominated by supply. So I think just even seeing this kind of, you know, temperature check on the quality of housing that we do have already is really, really important. And equally with Sarah's side, like the cohort that you're addressing here, again, really, really crucial, and a really brilliant approach to it. Like, so if there was no other questions, I don't think anything else has come in the Q&A. So I suppose it's just to thank Sarah and Helen for their time, and more importantly, thank them for the great pieces of work they've produced, really important pieces of research. And I would recommend anyone who's on the call that hasn't read it, please go and do so. It's really interesting and important stuff.
Thanks very much.
No problem at all. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Sarah. Okay, everyone. I'll let you go at that point.